start around like maybe another 5 minutes to allow our friends to hopefully can fill out the room here. Right, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, it's very lively discussion.
You remember me? I will see your studies too. Small. I think the last time you did, it was in Dataran Merdeka, right? No. Legacies where we did the lawan protest. When was the last time you met this?
Yeah, doing for just helping them. Back to the shop.
So true.
I know, I was not expecting this. When I came out, water.
It's like a more colonization, like
I should just start. She's intending to join. Hello. which is how do I describe it? I mean, Zikri is a staff. It's also, but it's funded by Siri. Again, a bunch of those and they hired Zikri. Who convenes also. How do you know it?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Siri, the program coordinator of Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, and I will be moderating the event today. Thank you so much for being here with us for our program, Transnational Activism from Bandung to now. Also, of course, welcome to all of our fellow participants who are following the live streaming via Pusat Sejarah Rakyat's Facebook page. This event is probably co-organized by 3 organizations: Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, an independent oral history and archival initiative focusing on the people's history of Malaysia and Singapore, Department of History, University of Bristol, and the International Institute of Social History, Amsterdam. This program is funded largely through a British Academy mid-career fellowship program held by Professor Lin Lewis. Also, in conjunction with that, we also just previously concluded a 2 days workshop with fellow participants from multiple archival practices entitled Documenting and Disseminating Histories of Labor and Social History in Southeast Asia. It is such a pleasure to have Professor Lin Lewis to deliver the lecture entitled Transnational Activism from Bandung to now with our fellow discussants today, Juliet Cheng, Ibu Ita Nadia, and Pak Kwan, our tutor. On that note, allow me to introduce our fellow presenter and discussants. Professor Lin Lewis is an academic, specializes in 20th century Southeast Asian history, exploring urban life, civil society, decolonization, and transnational socialism. Award-winning books, Cities in Motion, published in 2016, examines cosmopolitan port cities in colonial Southeast Asia. She also co-led an IISH-funded project on Afro-Asian Cold War networks, resulting in the publications of The Life of Cold War Afro-Asianism, published in 2022. Currently, she is writing on socialism in decolonizing Southeast Asia and co-edited the book entitled Socialism, Internationalism, and Development in the Third World. And of course, our discussants today, which represents a very interesting range, multitude of practices. Juliet Cheng is an active supporter of Pusat Sejarah Rakyat. In 1974, she was elected the first woman president of the University of Singapore Students' Union, which supported the struggles of workers during the first oil crisis, as well as the landless in Tasik Utara, Johor Bahru. Subsequently, she was expelled from the University of Singapore and detained without trial under the Internal Security Act at Kamuntek for a year. She was the UN Gender Advisor for its presidential elections in East Timor in 1976 and was defense lawyer before the United Nations ICTR in Tanzania. Also a member of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers that actively opposes terrorism. Second, we also have Ibu Ita Nadia. She wears many hats as a researcher, grassroots activist, feminist, and human rights advocate. She was the director of the women's organization Kalyana Mitra during the New Order regime and recently co-founded Ruang Arsip dan Sejarah, a research center and archive for women's history. She is also the co-founder of National Commission, Anti-Violence Against Women, and one of the board members of Amnesty International Indonesia. And last but not least, we have Pak Puan Aw Putong. She's a researcher with over 10 years of experience in violence and conflict, social memory and cognition across Thailand, East Asia and the Balkans. Her current work involved a feasibility study in establishing a peace museum connected to Thailand's Deep South. There's the three provinces, Yala, Narathiwat and Patani. Our co-founded initiative to establish the 6th October 1976 Massacre Museum and the Deep South Museum and Archive. She is also part of the working team for the documentation of October 6th, an archive dedicated to the Thammasat University Massacre of 1976. I think as we all know, this year, 2025, marks the 70th anniversary of the Asian African Conference in Bandung, which happened in 1955. Bandung is both a moment and a movement. It goes far beyond just a historic diplomatic gathering, spanning from the late 1940s to the 60s. It encompasses a vibrant network of constellation of artists from cultural workers, artists, politicians, as well as trade union leaders. So in that sense, what insights actually emerge when we view the Bandung era through these diverse lenses? How did these actors actually navigate the long history of anti-imperialist movements, to the Cold War climates of conflict and rivalry, to the current state of the emerging multipolar world that we are in right now? How do we understand Bandung as an abstract yet concrete idea of solidarity that continues to bolster and challenge the various movements that emerged from it? How do we see, how do we understand, how do we actually absorb the spirits of Bandung? So I think without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Lin Lewis to present the lecture. Please.
Thank you everyone for having me. Sorry, as always, technical difficulties, I think part of the course these days. So I wanted to thank again to Zikri, especially to Diana and to the board of Pusat Sejarah Rakyat for having me and for co-hosting this event. They've been absolutely amazing, both of you. Both for this event as well as the workshop that we've hosted for the past few days. And I also want to thank all of you for giving up your Friday evening to come and listen, and to those of you at home on the live stream. And I also want to thank our participants from around Southeast Asia who've come and traveled all this way for this wonderful workshop that we've had that has brought organizers, historians, and activists from around the region to come together and think about how we document and engage the public in histories of activism and social movements from the grassroots to the global and how we build archives of activism that have long been marginalized, ignored, or suppressed. Given that this is the year of the 70th anniversary of Bandung, I wanted to use the opportunity to go back to a previous era of activism in which the challenges of decolonization were perhaps more pressing to the wider public than they are now. This was an era of international solidarity against the common enemy of colonialism, and the Asian African Conference was a symbol of cooperation between countries that had been, for hundreds of years, under the colonial yoke, and a pledge to work together for a more equal world. Indonesia, the first country to declare its independence from colonizers after the Second World War, was the ideal host for the event. Bandung was once a colonial resort town in the hills and tea plantations of West Java, or Central Java, and became famous during the Indonesian Revolution, when revolutionaries burned down part of their own town in response to the Dutch reoccupation of the city. It was the site at the engineering college where President Sukarno had spent his formative years as a radical student and anti-colonial nationalist. But over 6 days, in April 1955, the modernist hillside bungalows housed not wealthy Dutchmen, but the leaders of Asia's new powers. The city was overrun with diplomats, statesmen, journalists, and photographers who were participating in this moment of resurgence for nations coming out of colonial rule. The Bandung Conference welcomed 29 countries and was hosted by Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Burma, Myanmar, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, which had secured their independence from colonial masters in the wake of the Second World War. The conference prioritized only those countries that had secured their independence. Malaya, Vietnam, and most African countries under colonial rule were not represented. Only 4 countries from sub-Saharan Africa were represented: Ethiopia, Liberia, Sudan, and the Gold Coast in Ghana, the first African country to receive its independence only in 1957. But Africa, and especially Ghana at the time, were so important that some Indonesian and Tanzanian intellectuals still remember Nkrumah being there, even though he was never there. And Nasser, who was the kind of revolutionary hero at the time, gave another sense of legitimacy beyond Asia. But as the scholar Naoko Shimazu has said, this was a theatrical performance staged before the world by the first generation of post-colonial leaders to make use of the international media. Photographs document the friendship between them. Nehru, the elder statesman, Zhou Enlai, the elder brother, Nasser, the charismatic revolutionary, and Indonesia's Sukarno, the great orator, who in his opening speech called it the first intercontinental conference of colored people in the history of mankind, and spoke of this idea of living in a world of fear with the rise of the nuclear bomb, and Afro-Asia as a source of peace. So this was a conference which laid the foundation for non-alignment and third world cooperation. Bandung might be one of the most well-documented conferences in history. We have a trove of written audio and visual material about it. The conference has its own protected archive under UNESCO's Memory of the World in Indonesia. And we have different accounts of the conference, including the African-American intellectual Richard Wright, the Philippine diplomat Carlos Romulo, and the Southeast Asian scholar George Cahin. But since the turn of the millennium, with the 50th and 60th anniversaries of the conference, as well as independence commemorations for Asian and African nations, Bandung has taken on a new symbolic and intellectual life for historians and the broader public, as well as politicians who have used it, for better or for worse, as a symbol of economic and political cooperation, as well as China's growing role in the global south. And yet Bandung, as a symbol, was more than a place and more than a single conference. This was an era not just of diplomacy by political elites, but also one where journalists, intellectuals, trade unionists, and women's movements in Asia and Africa were able to speak and connect with each other across borders. They included those in opposition to national leaders, as well as a diverse group of civil society actors and activists deeply involved in Afro-Asian solidarity movements, often for different reasons. So how do we document these exchanges and remember the different ways that people imagined and tried to remake the world in this period? Oh, sorry, there is Nako's article if anyone's interested. This was the aim of the Afro-Asian Networks Project, which I co-led with my colleague Caroline Stoltz at Leiden, which brought together historians working on different parts of the world to document the multiple networks of transnational activism in the period. This week, in the past few days, we've been talking a lot about collective research, collective practices of archiving, and sharing our archives and our history as collectives. And this is kind of what we tried to do as a research group. We were trying to challenge the idea of kind of single scholars working in the archives on their own, and publishing kind of single, pieces of research. We were really trying to operate as a collective and trying to make use of people's different expertise on different regions, and trying to do that from the point of view of the archives. So we all gathered together actually at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, which holds a huge collection of social movements across the left and the wider world to start researching together, and then kind of went off and collected our own material as well. But it was a sense of a shared project, and we published a manifesto in Radical History Review about titled under the Asian African Networks Research Collective about how we did that. But one of the ways we tried to do this was mapping various conferences of the era that occurred before, during, and after Bandung, the other Bandungs. And, why do we look at conferences? They are ways of kind of bringing people together across borders for a common purpose, to learn from each other as we've been doing for the past couple days. So, in thinking about this kind of network of conferences, and there's a really good visualization if you go to this website. You have to do it on a computer, but there's a good data visualization of all these different conferences, and actually you can click on the lines to see where people came from, and you can even get to the individuals if they're named in the conference reports and what they did and who they were. So it might be something to think about if you're interested in this period. But we were looking at who came to these conferences, what did they discuss, what were their goals? So in the rest of this talk, I want to go deeper into some of them and what they tell us about the period, especially in terms of the way Afro-Asianism changed, especially for the left. So rather than Bandung as a conference, it might be more accurate to think of the Bandung era as an arc of conferences that speak to various political possibilities for the decolonizing world. Oh yeah, here they are. These are all on the website. This is the data visualization. But just to begin in Delhi in 1947, so 8 years before Bandung. So this was the first time that Asia's post-colonial leaders met on Asian soil. It was a conference in many ways distinct from Bandung. So rather than entrenching the idea of the nation state, the Asian Relations Conference imagined a broader Asian community, founded on Nehru's belief in the need for a distinct Asian space to promote non-alignment, anti-colonialism, and anti-racism. The Indian poet and social activist Sarojini Naidu, who presided over the conference, was committed to both anti-colonialism and world peace. This was a conference about rediscovering inter-Asian connections and severing links to the colonial metropole. And as Caroline has argued, it was the culmination of inter-war Asianism, transnational organizing that had already taken place among trade unions and women's movements. But it wasn't without tensions. After the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, delegates from Burma, Indonesia, Malaya, Siam, and Indochina had a deep distrust of the idea of Asianism, which had provided the cover for Japanese occupation. So it was after this conference that the Burmese leader Aung San and Thai Premier Priti Banamyong helped found the Southeast Asian League to campaign for the anti-colonial causes in the region, including Vietnam's war against returning French forces. But soon after, the two masterminds of the League disappeared from the scene. Priti was exiled to France in a coup by the right-wing military leader Pibum Songkhram, and Aung San was assassinated, some say by rogue British agents. And Aung San's closest colleagues, UNU and the Burma Socialist Party, came to power and tried to make Burma a leading hub for the anti-colonial cause. At the Asian Relations Conference, members of the Burma Socialist Party had met with fellow socialists in India, Japan, and Indonesia, including Sultan Syahrir and Johan Sriruza from East Java, those in political opposition to the ruling national governments of the day, and vowed to organize an Asian Socialist Conference. So this happened in 1953, and it hosted 200 delegates from, including Clement Attlee, the first labor leader after the war, and as well as delegates from Egypt, from Lebanon, and all the way to Japan, including observers from Uganda, Kenya, and Tunisia. And this is 2 years before the Bandung Conference. The conference promoted socialism as a third way out of an escalating ideological war between American capitalism and Soviet communism, both of which it saw as new imperial powers. But it advocated Afro-Asian solidarity, human rights, and in many ways was a precursor to Bandung, as some people have argued. But women were far more visible as delegates, and there was a kind of a special clause in the resolutions about campaigning for gender equality, which was never in Bandung. Women were quite invisible in Bandung. But also, unlike Bandung, it wasn't just one event, but had a permanent secretariat in Rangoon and published newsletters to reach Asian as well as African audiences, and campaigned for an anti-colonial future. So there's a few of the periodicals that were published at the time, Socialist Asia and the Anti-Colonial Bureau newsletter, which was actually edited by a Ghanaian journalist and political operative very close to Kwame Nkrumah called James Markham. The next one. Oh, sorry. So I don't know if I showed it. Okay. So there's James Markham in Rangoon, but he also becomes one of the 3 Ghanaian delegates at the Bandung Conference in '55, 2 years later. Can we go back? It's important to remember also the role that the wives of the Asian socialist men played in terms of campaigning for the struggle for socialism internationally. And actually, with the Asian Socialist Conference, so this is Sujati Miono. She was the wife of Wiono, who was a close ally of Tan Malaka before the war, and part of the East Java group of the Socialist Party in Indonesia. But following the failure of the Asian Socialist Project and a lot of socialist parties imploded by the late 50s, it was the women who provided some of the organization's most enduring legacies in civil society. Beijing, meanwhile, became a new hub of leftist and women's internationalism, then under the banner of the World Peace Movement, with solidarity networks that reached across Asia, the Arab world, and Latin America. As Elizabeth Armstrong has shown in her work, Beijing hosted in 1949 a conference of Asian women. And here, a new generation of women from across Asia and North Africa convened to address imbalances affecting women in the world. 3 years later, it hosted the 1952 World Peace Conference, where activists from across Asia and Latin America met to oppose the use of nuclear and biological weapons and wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Malaya. Their focus was on national independence, women's rights, and cultural exchange. And part of Beijing's attempts to style itself as an anti-colonial hub would continue into the 1960s as they moved closer to countries in Africa. But the 1952 conference served as a networking hub between artists of the global left, including Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, husband of Frida Kahlo, who painted the main mural over the conference, and Rachel Liao, who some of you might know, has a very good piece on this on our blog, and I think an article as well. So these peace movements continue to play an important role in the formation of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization in Cairo in '57, a conference known as the People's Bandung, but also promoted by Nasser at the time. So this happened directly after British, French, and Israeli forces attempted to invade Egypt after Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. Nasser became the hero of Third World revolutionaries and vied to become the new leader of the Afro-Asian world. And he drew on the intellectual and activist networks between Egypt and the Arab world and Africa. And this is actually a time where you see a rift between Nasser and Nehru. So if Nehru represents the earlier generation of post-colonial leaders who tried to remain non-aligned, Nasser is representing the next, and moving much closer to the Soviet Union as a source of aid and patronage. At the same time, Kwame Nkrumah is trying to build unity across the African continent and turning in some ways away from Asia. These alignments are also reflected in the women's conferences that followed. There was a 1958 Conference of Asian and African Women in Colombo, which saw itself as a women's Bandung, and tried to remain neutral of politics at the time, although many of the delegates kind of challenged this idea. But at the time, they invited donors from foreign, from UN organizations, much to the consternation of the Chinese delegation, which was very upset at not having a seat at the UN table. The 1961 Afro-Asian Women's Conference in Cairo 3 years later was supported by Nasser and brought together women from across the Arab, African, and Asian worlds and put anti-imperial politics at the heart of the agenda. So here in both conferences we have the rise of new ideas about development, right? Ideas that are putting women at the heart of the development agenda. So both conferences, regardless of politics, are focused on women's education and political participation. The Colombo Conference also includes discussions on public health, slavery, trafficking, and labor. And in some ways is shaped but also contributes to national development priorities in international institutions like the UN. Whereas at the Cairo Conference, development takes on a much more insidious flavor because foreign aid is seen as a cover for business and military interests of Western powers, especially in the African continent. There's far more African representatives in the Cairo Conference. So this Cairo Conference happens directly after the political crisis in the Republic of Congo, following its nominal independence from Belgium, during which the Belgian government had redeployed its forces in Katanga to protect its mining interests there. So with a strong presence from African delegates, the Cairo Conference adopts the language of Kwame Nkrumah on the dangers of neocolonialism, that colonialism is not dead, but lives on. 5 days after the conference, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in a CIA conspiracy, creating a rallying cry that spread across the third world. For more on the coup, I really recommend anyone sees the really new documentary called Soundtrack to a Coup. But Dr. Posu Kai, who's in the audience, might remember publishing this image on the front cover of Fajar, the University of Malaya Socialist Club's newsletter, which said, Lumumba is dead, murdered. And we see these kind of rallying cries across Asia at the time, and across Africa, and across the third world. It creates a real sense of the symbolism of what neocolonialism represents. So Nyoto, the Indonesian communist leader and founder of LEPRA, writes a poem later put to music, which says, Lumumba's blood is scarlet red. Congo, your hunger is our own, your hunger we have in common, hunger for the revolution. Before I talk about LEPRA and the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, where Nyoto's poem is published, I just want to say something about Fajar as well, just coming back to the kind of more local level. So, again, Dr. Poe may remember publishing this article, which is, of course, the article which brought the editorial board of the University of Malaya Socialist Club under the charges of sedition by the British government, and which is claimed by some to be a real kind of, well, the kind of trial that launched Li Cheng's career, of course, because he was a part of the defense team. But this article itself, if we read the text, right, this is about neocolonialism. This is published 7 years earlier, and it's saying that, you know, that actually this is a crystallization. It is actually warning that we see signs all over Asia that the West is still a menace. Indochina, backed by French arms, suppressing the Vietnamese independence movement. China denied a seat at the UN table. The U.S. supplying arms to Pakistan. A military pact in Asia, CETO, right? And he quotes the British Labour politician and founder of the NHS, Aneurin Bevan, in saying, we view this as being for the purpose of imposing European colonial rule. So I think the story of what happens next is familiar to many of you in this room, in terms of this being a kind of really central to the birth of the PAP, which would later, upon coming to power, expel many of the leftists and trade union organizers that had been so integral to its early success. But for more on the story, I point you to Dr. Poe's memoir, as well as Lo Castaing's edited collection on the University Socialist Club. But Posupai also ran in these wider Afro-Asian networks. He attended the Afro-Asian Students' Conference in Bandung in '56, and also there was Hersri Setiawan, who later became one of the Indonesian representatives at the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau. Its first anthology was published in Nyoto's words about Lumumba in an anthology of Afro-Asian writers. This included Han Pei Ping's elegy to African drums and Sito Tutumurang's poem about a Cuban maid in Peking who hands him a banner of her country, celebrating the victory of her land over American aggression. So these writings give us a sense of what was left behind, from the Bulletin of the Afro-Asian Woman, many of which copies have disappeared, which we don't have, to the series of periodicals published by the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, based first in Colombo and then in Beijing. The different trajectories of these periodicals. So we have actually a split in the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau in Colombo, which some of them go to Cairo and publish Lotus, and some of them go to Beijing as a kind of split in the left, and a split into this leftist intellectual project. But both of them are very much against, are fighting this kind of anti-colonial cause, right? So Lotus goes back to the original charter of the Afro-Asian Writers Association, asserting that literary creations of this world are an integral part of the struggle waged by the people of Asia and Africa against colonial oppression. Throughout its lifetime, the journal not only explicitly condemned American aggression in Vietnam and the Israel-Palestine conflict, but also featured the work of North Vietnamese poets like Thanh Hai and Palestinian writers like Gaston Canafin. All of this happened within the shadow of the Cold War, as major superpowers vied for influence in the global South. The U.S. sent African-American jazz musicians to Africa and Asia, while the Soviets sent the Russian ballet. Both competed in forms of cultural propaganda to fund forms of cultural propaganda, magazines, mobile cinemas, film workshops, as well as exchange programs, scholarships, and travel funds for trade unionists and activists to travel and tour their respective countries. Artists, poets, performers, and musicians made use of all of these opportunities to advance their art. They saw international solidarity as an integral part of their visions of the nation and the wider world. So the Indonesian writer Pramudia Anantatur attended the Afro-Asian Writers Conference in Tashkent in 1958, sponsored by the Soviet Union. It allowed Pramudia to meet some of the most important writers of his day, creating what the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o called the links that bind us. Literary connections across the South enabled by the ability to meet Afro-Asian writers face to face. So I think it would be good to pause to think about how all of this was possible, technically, right? The 50s saw the inauguration of the jet age. It allowed for travel in stints and stops, allowing writers, activists to stop and see and know the territory. This is actually a route map of the same route that took Garuda from Jakarta to Tashkent, in which you had to stop in Rangoon, Delhi, Calcutta, and then to Tashkent, in which he spent a few days, at least a few days in each place, sometimes losing his passport, sometimes having to be helped by soldiers who kind of sympathized with the Burmese revolution, sometimes not helped by Burmese diplomats or Indonesian diplomats in Rangoon, but helped by taxi drivers. And it really shows, he writes about all of this in his memoirs, and it shows the kind of limits of Afro-Asian solidarity. What does it look like from the ground? How is it experienced? Because I think these conferences are just part of the experience. And a lot of the writers that write about being at these conferences, they write about the journeys to get there. What happens on these journeys? Who do they meet along the way? Right? So when they're going to these conferences, they're getting to know the territory. They're getting to know the places that are supposed to be represented. And I think that's a key difference of thinking about travel today and then, and about the 50s. Go ahead. There's a few nice, a few more interesting photos. This one is of Nasser, Unu, and Nehru in Rangoon on the way to the Bandung conference, participating in the annual water festival together. So you can see them trying to, I'm sure they were talking about all sorts of things, but all of these things are ways in which they're building trust, creating, networks and relationships even before those conferences happen. And this is just kind of thinking about the role of, kind of meeting on the tarmac, meeting at the airport. This is Shair arriving at the Asian Socialist Conference, and a range of Asian socialist women who took a trip together across Scandinavia at the invitation of the Scandinavian governments at the time. But some people were not allowed to travel, right? So the air travel was knitting the world together, but it also introduces a new kind of post-colonial politics. So while Cold War powers often funded the high cost of travel, they could also stop it. So fears of communism and Afro-Asian solidarity led the U.S. State Department to revoke the passports of African intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson to stop their participation at the Bandung Conference in 1955. Both were finally able to attend the 1958 Afro-Asian Writers Conference in Tashkent and Film Festival there. Du Bois was in his 80s. He somehow travels across the sea and then is in Europe, and then somehow takes one of these kind of milk run flights across to Tashkent. He's quite tireless, Du Bois at the time. And if any of you don't know of him, he's the one who I think in 1905 wrote the color bar, or talked about the term the color bar in the souls of black folk. The last conference I want to talk about is just the Tricontinental Conference in Havana, which happened, where actually Castro and the organizing committee there, the Afro-Asian People's Latin American Solidarity Committee, is actually drawing on a lot of the networks that were already created through the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization. One woman who was there is the Indonesian leftist Francisco Ganidaj, who actually has her passport annulled while she's at the conference during the coup in 1965, meaning that she's never really able to attend, to return back to Indonesia. She's exiled in China, I think, for about 20 years, and then she goes to the Netherlands. But she is a kind of testament to the rise of Asian authoritarian regimes from the 1960s. And I think many of you know that the 60s were not a good time for Southeast Asian leftists. Of course, there was a coup in Burma in '62, which inaugurated decades of military dictatorship that, apart from a decade long that would continue to this day, we had Operation Cold Storm in Singapore, and the events of 1965 in Indonesia that led to the disappearance or murder of up to an estimated 3 million leftists. So it speaks to the rise of authoritarianism in the global south, and especially in Southeast Asia, and a constrained space for the left to operate that was far less internationalist and conducive to anti-colonial solidarity. So I think our panel is going to take things forward from here, but I just want to offer a few starting thoughts. That maybe after a period of difficulty that lasted through the 60s and 70s, there was a new purpose for activists and a wider commitment to anti-authoritarianism and human rights, as well as continuing neo-colonial interests. And I think the Bandung spirit continues in some ways with attempts like the new international economic order in 1974, this set of proposals that is advocated by developing countries to end economic colonialism and dependency on the West. But this is, of course, rejected by the U.S. And we have from here the rise of neoliberalism. But nonetheless, I think there are certain kinds of, and I'm sure our panel can speak more on this, but different connections between the kind of world of the 50s and 60s and the kind of later worlds and later kind of forms of transnational and third world solidarity that we see through organizations like, that are, born in Malaysia, for instance, like Third World Network and the South Center, and also in part dawn development alternatives or women in the new era, some of which some of this panel have been involved in. But I just, this became very clear to me because as I was interviewing a lot of the children and students and the mentees of the people of the Bandung era, I just realized, how much many of them were activists, that they just kind of seemed to continue this kind of lineage of activism in new ways. And in the past couple of days, we've talked a lot about, the kind of the importance of having organizations, activist cultural organizations that are intergenerational. And I think that is just a really something that I already see in a lot of the activism around Southeast Asia, that everybody looks to their elders, looks to people, but we also see the ways in which older activists are, learning from younger people as well, and thinking about their, their creativity, their energy. And I think that's a very special thing about thinking about transnational activism as a form in this region. And thinking about the range of possibilities that we see in both the past and the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sulin, for the insightful lectures about Bandung and the other Bandungs that resonates hopefully until today. Of course, we're going to listen more from our discussants. Maybe I would love to invite our discussants to join us here. Yeah. Julia and you will start. So perfect. Once again, thank you so much, for your lecture tonight. I think, of course, like there's a lot of things that we can actually collectively ponder on how Bandung actually transpire in different forms, different ideas, different vision, and different spirits, right? And I think, of course, like our fellow discussants today can't wait to actually discuss it further from each of their own perspective and their participation. Of course, like with our independent historical condition, as well as in Juliet's perspective as a not necessarily just a student activist, but also as a very, the advocate for legal perspective on how different visions of state crafting process was being envisioned from time to time. And Ibu Ita, I think you absolutely have a lot to say about the involvement of lecturers as well as the cultural workers in Indonesian context. So maybe I would love to invite Juliet to go first to discuss about this.
Hello. Yes. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Juliet Cheng. I have been introduced as an ex-student activist from the University of Singapore Students' Union, and that was way back in 1974. That was 50 years ago. I'd just like to point out three realities. Firstly, we are all born into war. Yeah. And I take this title from Lin Lewis' autobiography, Born into War. So there is the two world wars, there's the Cold War, and after that I think all kinds of low intensity war going on. And of course today we are confronted with lots of other wars, but the Ukraine war and the war against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Yeah. So we are all born into war. Whether we like it or not, this is the reality of the geopolitical landscape that we are in. So we have no respite but to forge on. And the second reality for me was the dream of independence and an independent nation being shattered. And to learn that we are all in neo-colonial bondage. And I think I learned something from the slides when it happened, but this is the reality we are in. And of course the third reality is our resistance, yeah. And we have a background to the pre-Bandung event and the Bandung and the smaller Bandung and the various forms of Bandung. And also I would say I have been very shamefully absent from the conference, the workshop, but I attended the morning session of the first day, and to hear young archivists talking about how difficult and how precious it is to preserve the evidences of our resistance, and evidences in all forms, whether it's our t-shirt or our headband or really written materials or even weapons. So all your documentation today is very important. As we realize today, as we try to dig into documentation to realize our past, our rich heritage. So to all the young archivists, I would say I salute you all. Yeah. We were poor archivists. So this long road to freedom, which is the title of Nelson Mandela's autobiography, I believe, well, there have been some successes and a lot of setbacks. In my era of growing up, the victory of the Vietnam War is one such victory.
in 1975, April of 1975. That was my moment of saying, you know, we have made it. But of course, everything started unraveling quite soon around us because the forces that are against us are so much stronger. And they are continuously and relentlessly defending their position, while we are, we have to move. For us, is our consciousness has to be unshackled first. And that is a long job, a difficult job. And on top of that, we have almost no resources. But the solidarity we show each other is very enriching. Yeah. And I think my consciousness, before I came into the student union, there were local student struggles, but I owe it to the Thai students who had their revolution a bit earlier. Yeah. I mean, Kamasai and university. Although we don't know and don't understand very much, but they still touch you. Yeah. That there was, and it was a violent struggle. And for most Singaporeans Okay. And of course, then the US had what they call the Vietnam syndrome. So that was good. They were afraid to go to war. But of course, that they overcame that quite rapidly in another form. That means they don't call up their blue eyes and blonde-haired boys to war anymore, but they had a more professional army of Filipinos, of blacks, not conscription. And then, of course, although we were not aligned to any, I mean, by my time, the Soviet Union was very distant from our consciousness. But still, the fall of the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev singing, "I did it my way." You remember the French Sinatra song that he was so enamored with? That was quite disturbing, because at least that provided a counterpole, to the US. I mean, we understood US imperialism very well, but we do not understand the other side, except to know that it provided a counterpoint. So in that sense, it was disturbing, the fall of the Soviet Union. And then this whole thing called the end of history, that there is now only a unipolar world. But how can that be when this unipolar world can oppress all of us? And so we know that the Vietnam syndrome was quickly shattered when the US went to war against Iraq. What's it called? Weapon of mass destruction. And of course today, we don't have to be taught that the genocide is being televised, right? And then we have a different kind of organizing then. We were like the NGOs, the human rights NGOs were all over. They were about the only means that we could understand some, or be able to have some form of activism. So then came the concept of human rights instead of national liberation. And I think we also paid quite a price for that, and the color revolutions. And then the identity politics came in to divide us. I support identity politics because oppressed groups must be able to organize, but then we have to be able to unite and not be divided. There is a common denominator that runs through our oppression. But indeed, even long and short, we spend quite a lot of time in identity politics that had been to some extent divisive. even feminism was not spared. Yeah? And I had a professor, Professor Maiwan Lam, who wrote a very interesting little pamphlet, of which I remembered nothing, but her title was Feeling Foreign in Western Feminism. So my activism as a student was very, very brief. It was just 1974. So what am I doing at this conference? So I think, luckily, transnational anti-imperialist activism came largely into my life. I mean, I've been involved in many transnational organizations, but I will speak of briefly two. One is when I was a student, and that is the Asian Student Association. You want to put up my slide? Okay, this slide, I mean, in 1974, I was active in the University Student Union, but I was very blur. So, the Asian Student Association was already on the scene. It was established in 1969. I never knew that until I read this recently. But you accepted it because it had been, I mean, you inherited your student union and their activities. But they were very active, and they were organizing the only regional organization of students in Asia. And I think this is something maybe we lack today. We lack today, yeah. So my first involvement was in the anti-Tanaka protest in 1974. And the name tells you that he was a Japanese prime minister, right? And he was going to tour Southeast Asia in mid-January 1974. And very quickly, ASA galvanized the students' unions of Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and to confront it when we visit the place. Now, it has to do with economic imperialism, because after the war, I mean, the Japanese were not welcome because they had been aggressive, but somehow their compensation to the Southeast Asian countries that they had invaded was through so-called economic aid, and that was how they slided in. But by 1974, most students were against the kind of Japanese businessmen practices and felt that the trade was imbalanced. The terms of loans were kind of also not beneficial. But in Singapore, we had a very timid protest. We issued only a press statement or some letters that we handed to the embassy, where we pointed out not beneficial, one-sided. But our counterparts in Malaysia were stronger. They had a delegation that greeted Tanaka at the airport, about 100%, apart from raising the same issues of economic imperialism in Malaysia and in Southeast Asia. They also pointed out that Japan had this, well, what did they say? They wanted to internationalize the Straits of Malacca. That impinged upon the sovereignty of both Malaysia and Indonesia. So they protested on that note as well. And then my Thai counterparts, I think they lined the road from the airport to the hotel, and they gave him a real hard time. and he met the students, yeah. And the students criticized him, saying that he was not responsive and he looked down on them. But of course he was also very high. And then our Indonesian student counterpart was reported to have 2 days of rioting with 11 dead, 800 arrested, of university lecturers, students, activists, and others. And of course, their student leader, Haliman, was sentenced to 7 years in jail, right? So, Haliman. So that was the Asian Student Association that was able to unite us. And we had a lot of support from the Australian Union of Students and the New Zealand students. So that is the kind of activism that I think the university and university colleges have kind of dampened all of us out. Singapore as well as Malaysia, and I'm sure you all can talk about places. So, and I want to point out one other thing. Interestingly, ASA is part of ECOSOC, which is part of the UN organization. I do not know whether that is open to you all to try to apply for I don't know, membership status or something. Would it be beneficial? Would it create some solidarity? Or I don't know. I mean, I noticed that this is a UN, and then apparently they have access to some funds from the UN for their activity. I never know how or where the funds of ASA came from, apart from maybe some student subscription, but it would be beneficial nowadays for us to try to see whether we can make the UN work more for us. Then the second activism, transnational activism I was in, was with the International Association of Democratic Students. After being a failed architecture student, I decided that my next professional life is to be a human rights lawyer. Of course, it's not that law is really very conservative. Yeah. So, but in any case, this organization, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, before that, could we have the 3 ASA newsletters? Yeah. And yeah, the 3 ASA. Yeah. These are my only collections today. I do not know whether I do not know where their archive has gone because you have them.
What is left of it?
So the other one, the last organization I was in was with the International IADL, Association of Democratic Lawyers. It was founded in 1940 something and is considered to be with the Soviet bloc. Yeah. The Soviet facilitated a lot of its activities until it fell down, of course, until it collapsed in 1989, is it? Yeah. So I think the activists of IADL could travel on Interfloat, Aeroflot, free. So if you have international conferences and all, you can count on Aeroflot to fly you. But of course, it is such a, what do you call it? Well, the capitalist world laugh at the Soviet world and their business practices. So an activist will have to spend a long time in Moscow waiting for the connections to get out. But still, it is free. So that is a form of the Soviet support for these activities. But after Gorbachev sang his song, all this was over. So when every one of us are self-financing to go for conferences and all. I want to deal with one of my more personal experiences with IADL because I feel that there's some similarities with how I would see things today. So in 2001, in a very, very dark, wintry night, a young woman Korean activist came to my office and woke me up and asked me to get onto the telephone and call up a lawyer in Brussels. And I remembered her name to be Paulette. collect something which I cannot remember. Well, maybe because I speak some French. So the long and short is, the IADL was going to organize in 2001 a conference recalling the massacre in Korea of 1951, and that was called the Truth Commission on Crimes in Korea. So the Korean women had wanted this Belgian lawyer to be at the conference. Apparently, she was linked to one of the earlier investigations, but it's not the 1951, because I looked at the names and her name was not there, or is not there. So that forced me to go and deal with some of the literature of the time, and I went to look at the report of the International Women Democratic League. The International Women Organization. It is the Women International Democratic Federation, and it is activist women lawyers from various countries, Scandinavian, whatever. And these women went in mid-1951, 6 months after the massacre in Korea, to investigate the crimes there. The language was very, very tame compared to today. Nobody said it was a genocide. Nobody even said war crimes. They just said crimes of the US. So I think in terms of international law, on international crimes, we have also progressed quite a bit. Yeah, to be more precise and to be more brave in naming the crime. So I just want to read to you sections of their report, which was revived for the conference in 2001, 50 years later, right? And it says, this woman who is a lawyer from Denmark, Kate Floron, she wrote, corpses and remains of bodies in mass graves are an ugly sight and an unreal one. These atrocities have been committed less than 6 months ago, but the open graves cannot be actualized for you. I wished I could turn on my heels, walk away, and shout the sight out of my mind, because I do not know what to do with it. I do not know what to think about it. Isn't that what has confronted us on the screen for the last 400 odd days with the scenes in Gaza? So this report also says, how did this group of foreign women end up in the middle of the Korean War? And why is it that they are barely mentioned in any histories of one of the most destructive wars of the 20th century? So we held the Korean Truth Commission report in 2001 based on this report of 1951. And the declaration says that there was systematic destruction of food stalls and food factories, and systematic destruction of towns after towns. There was carpet bombing. 1 out of every Korean family, 1 out of every Korean family at least lose one member or something like that. And there was also systematic destruction of all hospitals, health centers. Doesn't that all sound very familiar? And and the last phrase they used was there was extermination of the Korean people, which today we call genocide. And so they end by saying the mass torture and the mass murder surpass the crimes committed by Hitler Nazis in temporarily occupied Europe. So I just want to end here to say that we are now, as always, in the thick of anti-imperialism and the wars that they unleash on us. But I want to say that there must be hope, and there must be resolve, continued. And then I would always go back to the efforts that I saw today, yesterday, and I hear that from your archiving activities that we will collect the evidence and they will be what do you call? Yeah, the truth. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Judith, for sharing with us a very vast spectrum of your participation as a student activist, as well as your legal background and how can you like what happened right now with the ongoing genocide in Palestine today. Maybe I would like to go straight to our second discussant, Ibu Ita.
Oke, selamat malam. Selamat bertemu kembali di Malaysia. Because we are in Malaysia, so I said selamat malam. Okay, I'm Ita Nadia from Indonesia. For me, Bandung 1955 is not just a history, but it is part of my family because my father actually he is an activist from the left wing of the Socialist Party in Indonesia, and at this time he was the advisor of the Prime Minister of Ali Sastro Amijoyo on the political advisor. So my father was very active. Before the 1955, he was signed by Shahrir to join the International Socialist in Burma, in Rangoon. So he was there for 1 year. And another part is my mother was the secretary of the Prime Minister of Amir Sarifuddin. She was the stenographer of Prime Minister of Amir Sarifuddin. So I was born into the family of the activism. And then I married with the, one of the writers who were appointed by Nyoto and Sukarno to become a representative of Indonesia in the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau in Colombo for 5 years. But unfortunately, after the atrocity in 1965, he was detained and sent to the Guru Island camp, concentration camp in the eastern part of Indonesia for 10 years. And now he was very ill in Yogyakarta. I stay in Yogyakarta, but actually he was already wrote books about his experience in Guru Island, and also he wrote a diary where he was in Guru Island. So actually I was part of all the Bandung conference. Yeah. My mother and my father actually always remembering us in the family, that political is not just, but political is part of my everyday life actually. And when Julia said that in 1974 she was member of the ASA,
I was member of the ASA in the 1979 when I was as a student movement in Gajah Mada University. And through ASA, I was sent to the Philippines for the 3 months and joined the underground movement, student underground movement in the Philippines. So I think it is very important for me that how to continuing the Bandung spirit for nowadays. That we have to confront it with the fascism, the right wing, the militarism. So I would like to give a comment about the Bandung conference. Actually, we have to begin with the 18 April 1955, when Sukarno speaks about let a new Asia and new African be born in front of all the participants of the Bandung conference in the Gedung Merdeka in Bandung. So the voice of Sukarno is very loudly. Let a new Asia and Africa be born. So what is the meaning be born for us as a people of the Afro-Asia continent? Be born meaning that the conference against the colonialism and the imperialism in all its manifestation has to be closed. And Sukarno again and again, it is not just in the Bandung and the Gedung Merdeka in Bandung, but also in all over the city in Jakarta. And according to my father, that the 1955 after April, all the students of the Indonesia has to be part to speak or to remember about the 10th Bandung spirit. So every student has to remember the 10th Bandung spirit against the colonialism and against the imperialism. But what is the meaning of the Bandung actually? The meaning of the Bandung actually is the political consolidation of the peoples of Afro-Asia. It is not just a meeting, sitting together, discussion, but consolidation. The consolidation, political consolidation of the peoples of the Afro-Asia. They have to think about the position, the location of politics of their life within the context of the Cold War. So this is the meaning of the Bandung conference. Yeah. Actually, my husband always said that the spirit of the Bandung, that we have to think, that we have to recalling back to our memory, is about to fight against the neo-colonialism, the imperialism. But then Bandung become the enemy of the American and the West. Why? Because after the Bandung conference, actually the 5 bureaus, they developed 5 bureaus who were very important bureaus in all over the world. It's about the Bureau of Journalism, the Bureau of all to organize the journalists based in Jakarta. And the head of the journalists of the Afro-Asia is Yusuf Ishak. Yusuf Ishak is very well-known publisher of Pramudia Anantatur. He was based in Jakarta. Second is the Writers Bureau. So the Writers Bureau based in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And the Writers Bureau, the task of the Writers Bureau, actually my husband is the representative of Indonesia in the Writers Bureau for 5 years. And his task is to travel around Africa, in Asia, and then to conduct a discussion among the writers and the cultural activists on how to organize political organization to fight against the colonialism and imperialism. So he traveled a lot. His life is just his life in the traveling through Africa and Asia. He always told me about the importance of traveling, how important the work with the peoples. Speaking about what is the colonialism, what is the context of the politics of the Africa, what is the context of the politics of the Asia, and how the Asia and Africa has to work together, bringing all the political situation, looking at the political location of their colonialism and imperialism. I'm now with my colleague, created Ruang Arsip and Sejarah Perempuan. But actually, now we are on the task to looking all the books of his work during the Afro-Asia Conference, all the archive. And I saw how he traveled without paying. But the spirit of how he has to fight against the neocolonialism and imperialism. He told me about when he went to Aljazair, he met with Herr Ahmad Herr, who was hanged by the French. And before that, he met with Frans Fanon. And how they built a new alliance. The spirit of the alliance under the Bandung Conference. Let a new Asia and Africa be born. Be born is very important for the peoples of the Asia, Africa. And the Writers' Bureau in Colombo, and then the labor movement also in Colombo, and then the jurists is in Conakry, and then the civil society movement is in Cairo. So each people, the movement follow about the 10 Bandung spirit. And they are very, very strong. Work on to fight against the colonialism and imperialism. So, then Sukarno after that, spoken again about the new emerging forces, or NEFO. And NEFO sound all over the Afro-Asia continent. Everybody knows what is NEFO. What is the spirit of NEFO? This is the time that the West and the America thought that they are my enemies. So then, after that, they kill, I think, one by one, the head of the government of the Asia, Afro-Asia. And I witnessed how about the 65, that half of my family was killed, my father was disappeared, then my husband was sent to the Buru Island for 10 years, and then also my auntie was disappeared, and then also both of the around 3 million people of Indonesia were killed, detained, and tortured, also raped. Now, I would like to, before I finish my discussion, is that again we have to think about that again, that Afro-Asia movement or the Bandung movement is about the political consolidation.
So, because of the political consolidation, I think we have to think again that how the imagination of the Asia-Africa can become the intervention in this current geopolitical. So, the imagination, because I think the imagination of the Asia-Africa is still masih relevant, yeah, still relevant, yeah, and I think it can become an intervention in the current geopolitical of today when the right-wing fascist, yeah, government is spreading everywhere. So, for us in Indonesia, the Bandung spirit has to bring back again with the new spirit. But what we have to look at back to the spirit of the anti-colonialism and imperialism in the current geopolitical. And before I finish, I will say that, especially for us, that we have to confront it with the new militarism under the President of Prabowo, how the marriage between the militarism, the oligarchy, and the capitalism. And now we already face those challenges that we have to think again, and we have to prepare with the new political situation. So, I think that we in Indonesia has to develop or has to membangun jaringan kembali di antara tanah Nusantara Melayu ini menghadapi situasi geopolitik yang baru. Ini adalah ancaman terbaru kita, ancaman humanity, ancaman kemanusiaan yang harus kita hadapi sekarang. Ini adalah semangat yang diturunkan oleh Bandung, yang harus kita pikirkan kembali. Dan ini waktunya kita untuk bekerja bersama, membangun kekuatan bersama, membangun jaringan politik bersama. Indonesia, Malaysia, Filipina, dan negara-negara Thailand, dan negara-negara Asia yang lain. Saya kira itu komentar saya pada pidato sore. Terima kasih. Selamat malam.
Thank you so much, Ibu Ita, for sharing with us your reflection, a very personal, but very political implication of how Bandung actually affects you, and of course affects the larger public life of the Indonesian people and the region. And of course, like we have the last discussion, how.
Thank you. Hi. Selamat malam, everyone. Swadika. Okay, so thank you, Siri. I learned a lot about Bandung spirit, and your talk and Bandung spirit like encouraged me to like reflect myself what I did not know, what I don't know, what I should know, and what I have been taught in my country. So but I asked myself, what do you know about Bandung? Just only one thing. And I asked my mom, she is like, kind of like, she is a simple but so sophisticated marker. So she told me that, yes, of course, I know Bandung. Our prince very well exiled to Bandung and lived there for the rest of his life and never come back. And I asked and when I came to know that you talk about Bandung, so I asked my friends, 20 friends, like initial survey, what do you know about Bandung? And everyone said, yes, we know Bandung is like one province in Indonesia, and the prince very proud here exiled to Bandung. So who is him? He is Prince Baripat. He is the son of King Rama the fourth, and he played very Pradeep Manunkam and Black Bun Songkram and other students they graduated from they went to Europe like France, Germany, and some graduated from England, and then they come back to Taiwan and they formed the group Kana Rasadon, and the thing about is Taiwan should change from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, democracy. So anyway, okay, next slide please. Can I stand there so I can see the slide? Okay, so this is former palace in Bandung. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so because I didn't know anything about Bandung, so I compared what happened in 1955, Bandung convent, and what happened in Thailand at that year. So what happened? Okay, so it's very interesting and very kind of critical time. What happened in Thailand? Queen Siri gave birth of Queen Sirihan. She is a crown princess of Thailand. So let's see what will happen in Thailand. Maybe soon or never. I really don't know. Okay, so Black Bun Songkram, he served as our prime minister. And what else? Well, yeah. And Thailand got a loan from the World Bank for $12 million. And after that, I learned about spirit of Bandung, and then after all, it's non-alignment movement. It's like you became a neutral during the Cold War, and it's made me think and how about Thailand? Were we really neutral? Are we really neutral? So next slide, please. Yes. So this question, when we look at the Indonesia spirit of Bandung, we remain neutral. But in Thailand, during the Cold War, you talk a lot. Everyone, Siri, Juliet, and Eva talk about the conference in Colombo. And in Thailand, we joined Colombo plan. I think everyone know about Colombo plan, right? One element of Colombo plan is it's like we got economic aid from the US to encounter the spread of communist regime. So what happened? So in Thailand, sorry to say, Thailand. So back to the question: were we truly neutral? Look at the World War II. I think the Thai fellow, I know from Museum of Popularity History, from a women archive from the University, and Joy from Bristol Museum Archive. And we grew up and we learned that Thailand was neutral during World War II, right? But I came to know when I wrote thesis about Asian women, Asian comfort women in Thailand. It's just like, oh my God, what I learned from school, we were not neutral at all. We were only one country in Asia that we were great alliance with Japan. Sorry, Asian people. What did Vietnam wrong? We, Thailand, again, okay, during World War II, we were great alliance with Japan. After the war, we shipped side to the US. Yeah, we were I don't know, but this is the way that we survive. Okay, so Vietnam War. I'm so sorry to say that, what to say, it's like, if you look in Thailand during the Cold War, communist, the war against communists, we have student movement, labor movement from the movements. I think I don't need to say what happened during that time because our experience is similar to Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and any countries in Asia, Korea, Japan, or even in Latin America, or even in Eastern Europe, we face similar experiences during the Cold War. So I want to talk a little bit about the Vietnam War. Thailand really, how to say it, like we support, we facilitate the Vietnam War. Look at how many military bases in Thailand. I think how many? More than 10? More than 5? More than 10. More than 10. Yes, and the military airplane carry the bomb and the air orange, the bomb from U.S. military base located in Thailand to Vietnam. And we, Thailand and Vietnam, why Thailand have to enter to Vietnam War? And even Thai military say Thai, it's like at that time, it's like we recruited so many Thai guys to be a soldier in Vietnam. And I feel like, why? What happened? What happened? So this is a thing that we don't learn in school. I learned when I went abroad for my graduate school. I learned from other countries. I not learned in Thailand. So that's why it's like learning space is like friend from Indonesia. It's like that kind of activity is really important because friend from Indonesia who run the learning space. Where are you? Okay, so that is really important in your work because you organize activity that like outside school. So anyway, so next slide. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit about what happened during the Cold War, after student movement. I think many of you know about the massacre in Thammasat University that took place on the morning, the dawn of 6 October 1976. So, and it's like if you visit our website, documentation of October 6, you will see so many photos. And I want to say it's like at the time, no Facebook, we don't have like our social platform. So the photo that served as evidence of the violence at that time is kind of like became public 2 years after the incident. It's kind of like take some time to travel outside Thailand, so people from outside Thailand know what happened inside Thailand. And one the dean of the Thammasat University at that time, he had to flee Thailand to England, Professor Whiten Pargon, and because of him, and because of transnational cooperation, the support from Amnesty International and was Thai student alumni in the US and in Europe, and also Asian Student Association because of this group. So it became to the movement against military government and after 2 years of the incident and became to amnesty bills. Of course, I don't like the amnesty bill because it's cover everyone, it's like perpetrator, authorities, everyone. But somehow it's kind of support the students as civilians who flee to join Communist Party in the forest, come back and continue the cycle. So, and next slide. Okay, so what happened with Prince Barika? The first photo. So his palace became a restaurant. So if you visit Bandung, you can visit Daha Party restaurant. A review from TripAdvisor said it is very good. Anyway, so I would like to add that you can see the rise and the fall of the monarchy. And the rise again during the Cold War. And some people in Thailand hope and dream possibility again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think of course it is a very entertaining, but what I mean, I have a but it's very entertaining, but at the same time, there's a lot of talks to it, like how should we address the question of neutrality? Because with the ideas of Bandung, we as a non-aligned movement afterwards, but then neutrals can be just a ambivalent terminology, right? There's always, everything is at stake. When we talk about what happened from the experience of Julian's and of course from your experience, like everything is at stake, especially if you're going to confront the powers that be. So I think maybe I'm just going to open the discussion to the floor. If there's any question, if there's any sort of reflection from everyone, feel free to share, feel free to ask. Yeah, all right, we have to. Just introduce yourself and pose the question to whom.
So my name is Yana, and I'm also a feminist activist, facilitator, trainer, organizer, mobilizer. I've worked a lot nationally, but I've actually also worked a lot globally as well as regionally in many of these multilateral processes that we see today that are currently failing us. And I think it's one of those spaces that you really see the asymmetrical power relation close by, day in, day out. When you go to negotiation spaces and you see in all these conferences just how much power imbalances there are between states alone. We haven't even talked about the rich or poor within a government, but between states, and it's so apparent in many of these spaces. And I actually had the privilege last year as part of my work to be at the Bandung Museum, which actually had a brought me very mixed feeling. Because I think, as I mentioned, I'm a feminist, and as was mentioned by Siri, it's a space that you enter and it's devout of women, effectively. There's a woman cut out sitting in the corner when you enter the museum and you ask our tour guide, who's this woman? And they're like, we're not sure, maybe a journalist or something like that, right? When women were so integral to the independence movement in so many of these countries, and yet there's hardly any women in that space. But at the same time, it was also just a very powerful space to be in, to recognize and recall and acknowledge just how much, in a way, courage that many of those leaders had at that time to demand and carve out their own space amidst, what was still a very colonized world, right? And so in that sense, it was a very kind of mixed feelings to me. And I think as someone who's on the activist side and don't do a lot of the archiving and historian work that all of you do, I think it really echoes so much of the appreciation for that kind of work, because for another activist to be in that space is to recall the power and the strength and the solidarity of that particular moment. And so I think, and I actually have kind of two questions and sort of thoughts as well. The first is that because I'm quite curious as to why Latin America was so completely kind of uninvolved within this particular process until much more later. And I remember having this conversation with Latin American activists, and very little of them know about this conference at all. Whereas you talk to African and Asian activists, they know about it at the very least, and some, do share the idea of pride and, respect towards it. But you talk to Latin American and majority don't know. So I'm quite curious if any of you would have any insight as to why, what was the context at that time. Because many of the Latin American countries were already independent. They were not yet subjected to the Chicago School of Economics, the big policy yet until about a decade later. So I'm quite curious if you have any insights on that. And I think my second question, and it's also sort of for everybody as well, as an activist, I have been talking to a lot of different groups around Cairo about thinking about how do we kind of reinvigorate the Bandung spirit for this year. In Bandung, though bearing in mind the current context of the return of authoritarianism, in Indonesia as well, but just how necessary it is for us to be able to mobilize society and social movements and activists across the global south to sort of like come together again this year to sort of recall that spirit, I think, that Rita was mentioning, and really reaffirm and reassert that political, identity and solidarity and power as well within this current global context.
Hi, sorry, my question's a bit long-winded, but it's kind of to everyone. My background is kind of in health systems and health research. But so evidently the Bandung conference culminated from and was a precursor to a variety of nationalist movements that tried to chart out a third way outside of Western capitalism and Soviet socialism. Considering how loads of states that tried to accomplish this, like this third way, resulted in a variety of coup d'etats initiated by the West. For example, Sukarno in Indonesia, as mentioned, Nkrumah in Ghana, even Ben Bella in Algeria. Can a truly non-aligned movement be possible, or would it be better for multipolarity if the global South allied more strongly with the socialist East? I'm thinking mainly of the argument that Walter Rodney had against Nkrumah, in that by identifying the socialism yet also identifying the third way, it resulted in basically another version of bourgeois thought, identifying the material conditions within Ghana. That's the question one, so I have a couple more, it's kind of related. And if we were to revitalize an anti-colonial spirit struggle, would this be possible without framing it in a socialist mode of thought? Based on what history has shown, colonialism and fascism are one and the same, and these are mere expressions of capitalism's need for collective accumulation. I reference Amy Cesar's discourses on colonialism. So how would a truly anti-colonial movement be fostered without it being primarily anti-capitalist and therefore socialist? Third one is not really the national liberation, but more feminism. So the theme of feminist and women's rights groups as a backbone of those of third world movements has been kind of encompassing decolonization in general. And I think Juliet mentioned that ever since the advent of the Cold War and after the Cold War, it's kind of been substituted by an introduction of identity politics and human rights frameworks within feminism. Would it be more helpful to emancipation to kind of reframe feminism into a proletarian feminism? I'm thinking of Nadezhda Krupskaya and Alexandra Kolontai, and perhaps view gender as less of a reified category and more of a class division, kind of like what Sheila Smith Firestone wrote in Dialectics of Sex. Thank you. That was kind of long, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Sakti. I'm from the Singapore Collective. I work on disability rights. Just a very general question for the panel. And especially because we're talking about transnational activism, decolonization. Because a lot of the attitudes that we have towards stable process are informed by colonialism. I was just wondering whether in your own experiences, in your Cairo work, have you noticed an increasing trend in how advocacy, activism, or contribution in Asia has been inclusive or not inclusive of disabled persons? And whether, let me just cite an example. The Black Panthers were very supportive of disability rights in the 70s. Do you see a similar trend, or do you see similar instances of support for disability rights activism in this region onwards from the 50s onwards? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all the questions. I think maybe I can have Dr. Siri to address.
Okay, thank you. What's your name?
Diana.
Diana, thank you, Diana. I'll start with your questions, and I'll let others answer as well. But just to say that, yes, the book, Naoko Shimazu, who I also mentioned, has a really great article on the invisible women in Bandung and how they conducted a kind of invisible form of diplomacy in the Darwis volume on the 60th anniversary. Good to read volume, yeah. The Latin America question, as you said, there were already independents. This was a conference, and 55 is a conference for, countries that just received their independence. How do you build a world after empire? But then you have the tricontinental, which is much more about, as I was trying to say, there's a movement from Bandung towards, kind of a much more leftist view of Afro-Asian solidarity. And that then gets, translates well for Latin America because it is about, by the 60s, it is about Latin American revolution, far leftist revolutions, right? So we have Castro's leftist internationalism, anti-colonial internationalism. So it's a new kind of, now this is something Latin American countries have been dealing with throughout the 19th century, early 20th century, this issue of neocolonialism, right? U.S. economic power, right? So they are, this question of like hard imperialism to kind of neo-colonialism is something that Latin American countries are very aware of. So I hope that also somewhat answers this question about the move towards a more social reform rather than a kind of non-aligned movement. I haven't seen anything about disability rights activism in this period. And I think that, I do think something, and I think maybe others can comment on this, but there's a movement, I guess, we talked about identity politics, but, going on to the 70s and 80s, that things become much more issue-based, I think, for a lot of activists in some ways, and I think that's also really important. So it'd be great to hear from maybe some of you about that, maybe thinking about that issue of different kinds of issues, of how activism around certain issues, is that more successful? Is that more, how important is that versus kind of larger processes? So I think your point, Juliet, about identity politics are important, but we also have to be united. I was really curious about that, and I think it's a really good point.
I don't think I can answer any other question except to perhaps. I think identity politics is identification. The group you feel safe in, the group you can express yourself. Is not very important. Yeah. But I think we all have to link back to the common denominator that oppressed all of us. So I think sometimes when that opportunity presents itself, then perhaps we should go into it. I prefer maybe refer to the Occupy movement, the 99% versus the 1%. Why did it fit? Why did it? What do you call it? Yeah. Why? No. In resonance, but why did it peter out? Yeah. Of course, our opponents are very sophisticated. Yeah. But they are. But some of us have to take some responsibilities for ourselves. And I kind of learned that certain top leaders in the feminist movement, for example, she wasn't willing to go and support Bernie Sanders for certain reasons. I think we have to move on the lowest common denominator for a broad united front. And whatever beyond that, maybe we could achieve one day or another day. But without having this broad united front to at least seize political power, then perhaps it's kind of difficult to move on. That's basically my point. It's very hard, yeah. Like I always refer to the Iranian women. Why did they go back? When they were in London, why did they go back? To Khomeini. And suffered that kind of, some of them suffered terrible repression. But yet, on the other hand, Iran has argued that their women receive education. So, I support them going back. I think it's a correct decision that you have to go back to fight. although sometimes we flee, right? We are like cowards, we flee too. But I think the overriding and overburning desire should be that we must get rid of the external pressure. And after that, let us put our own house in order. But there will always be differences. And therefore, we have to respect diversity. But to let diversity impede upon the common denominator, that I think is a real pity.
About what's the tiara? I think for the museum in Bandung, actually we are, as a feminist in Indonesia, we oppose the museum because the museum is not just a building, but the museum is a part of the political aim of the government. So if you enter the museum in Bandung, you did not find about the women's movement. With my friends here, we have a ruang arsip dan sejarah perempuan, and we focus on the women movement who are disappeared from this history. And we look at the period between the 1914 to the 1965, were very, very strong women movement in Indonesia, were very strong in the activism from the national, regional to the international. Yeah? But because they are from the leftists, they did not put into the book of the history. So we are now recalling memory, recalling the story of the women movement to bring back. But recently, the new president just building the theme of the history, the new history, and we thought that they will disappear all those leftist activism, and especially about the women movement. If I will tell you the story, her story of the women movement in Indonesia, actually is disappeared after the 1965 atrocity. This is very important. Yeah. So the changing of the geopolitics in Indonesia, according to me, began in 1965. And it is not from the Indonesia, but also in the Asia, Africa, and all over the world. I think from the start, yeah, the changing of the geopolitics started in the 1965. Yeah. And I think the civil society, we lost a lot of the voice of the civil society in Indonesia. The new president, the previous president, Joko Widodo, actually started since 10 years ago to control the voice of the civil society. But control the president just the tools of the politics of the oligarchy and the militarism. Yeah. So now it is time for us to look at the politics of the location of us as a feminist, as semua manusia harus melihat the location, the politics of location of where we are now in the intersectional of the political, the global politics. So I would like to say that, okay, as an NGO, I was in the NGO for 40 years. Actually, we are working with the orang asli, with the gay rights, with all this semua civil society. Tapi sekarang mundur. Kita mundur, terus mundur terus. Perjuangan mundur. Itu kenapa? Nah ini juga satu pertanyaan. Aku bahas yang karena lebih enak. Jadi ini bukan hanya problem di Indonesia, tapi bagaimana juga kita melihat ini sekarang problem kita ada settler colonization. Settler colonization is the face of our challenge. Papua, Palestina, Papua, and every corner. Settler colonization. And then we have to think about what is the feminist decolonization. Untuk saya tidak akan mengikuti feminist decolonization yang di Prancis atau di mana tidak. Kita harus melihat the problem of the feminist decolonization in our space, ruang kita bagaimana. Nah ini yang penting saya kira untuk melihat kembali. Jadi kita diminta untuk berpikir kembali, melihat, membawa Bandung spirit untuk menjadi tools, untuk melihat kembali di mana kita berada. Dan dekolonisasi juga harus diperbarui. So we are not practicing theory, but we are theorizing from the practice. We see all this problem, and then lihat dan diangkat menjadi satu yang baru, perjuangan baru. Dan saya kira ini menjadi penting. Saya belajar sejarah, saya dari sejarah. Saya melihat dulu ada hubungan yang sangat erat antara Malaysia dan Indonesia. Saya dulu aktif di Timor Leste, dan itu ada organisasi antara Timor Leste yang ada di Malaysia, di Indonesia. Nah sekarang kita terpecah. Nah, bagaimana kita melihat situasi di Asia Tenggara ini? Bagaimana kita memperhatikan political situation yang kita sedang hadapi sebagai feminis? Saya juga feminis. Tapi bagaimana kita tidak melihat feminis kita adalah melihat problem perempuan di dalam interseksional yang menindas kita di Asia ini. Ini saya kira yang penting juga tentang problem kesehatan, problem bermacam-macam. Ini yang kita harus duduk bersama. Menjadi penting untuk melihat kembali strategi-strategi perjuangan kita selanjutnya.
Yeah, since we're almost running out of time, maybe if there's any one last short, brief questions from the audience. Ada something yang macam tak tanya soalan tak ada video lah macam. Yeah. If there's anyone, yeah, alright.
Assalamualaikum, selamat sore, Assalamualaikum. I just have a quick question about, I guess, what do you see the value of learning from history, which might sound like a stupid question, because Bandung exists in a very specific moment in world history of decolonization. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you expect people of this new generation to take from the struggles of activists from that era, and how exactly do you apply it to our concerns right now? Thank you.
I think I started off by saying that we are all born into war. We are all born into war. Yeah, and that situation, that geopolitical situation has not really changed, but it has evolved. It has taken on new forms, new faces, but basically today we are still oppressed, maybe neo-oppressed. So I think it is still as relevant. What the history of the past is still as relevant as it is for today, although the specificity has changed. Yeah, I think our opponents, so that I not be accused of being very extreme to call them our enemies. I think our opponents are much smarter than us because they know what they're defending. And for us, maybe as to learn that we don't even own our minds. Yeah? We first have to liberate our own minds. So I think lessons of histories of the past can be a bit, is still necessary and illuminating. Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's a good question to end on, especially given we've done this kind of workshop with all these wonderful archivists, young archivists, especially from around the region, that are trying to preserve histories that have been, not talked about so much. How do we educate people? And I think it speaks to the idea that history is a kind of, it's constantly being created, it's constantly being rediscovered. It's a process. Even Bandung is can be used in certain ways. History can be used in authoritarian ways or in misused. So how do we actually go back to the sources? How do we engage with each other, talk about what's happened, do oral histories, talk to the people that were really there? I think history is also kind of always in the process of being kind of rediscovered and talked about and being useful and inspirational to new generations of activists. So hopefully it's a good way to end.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the recent Juliet, and of course, and lastly, the students for such a very important lecture tonight. So, yeah, of course, like Bandung is very embedded in contradiction. It is far from being a monolithic rock, as what we learned from the conversation that we have tonight. So, yeah, once again, I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you so much to everyone for staying with us. Yeah, last but not least, yeah. If you have the time, kindly visit Pusat Sejarah Rakyat's website and our social media platform for future activities. Have a good weekend. Thank you.